What is the purpose of a cleric? Is it to ensure someone prays to the gods before your party eats the rations nobody in your party is keeping track of? Or is it to pop pesky goblins like the deadheads they are with the righteous fury of your holy hand grenade? Regardless of whether or not your GM allows magic items from the Isles of Great Britain, one thing I do know is that if something exists, we can probably make it better. So let's take a higher perspective on this class of holy conviction. Clerics are so much more than the clerk who sits in the swivel chair at the front desk listening to all your problems, even though that's where their name came from. But what if I told you the purpose of a cleric is to represent the one who sent them? Well, their purpose can't possibly be that simple, Assassin. But before you go rant in the comments about the lack of cleric representation in all my homebrew content, let's pretend I'm right. If your cleric believes their purpose is to represent the one who sent them, who just so happens to be their god, then imagine, how would your cleric feel after killing a fly if they serve the god of the fleas? God of the flies, god of the fleas. Now you may not like this next example because you're probably not a cleric of cold brews, at least yet. But what if your cleric serves the god of matcha lattes and is faithfully drinking one every single day for the past 24 years as an act of devotion to their god? I'd imagine your cleric would walk around with a pep in their step from all that liquid IBS. They may even act a little stuck up because it feels good to do what's right. But let's be real. Have you ever told a lie? I know I have. That makes us both liars. Have you ever taken something that doesn't belong to you but then didn't give it back? I know I have. That makes us both thieves. Have you ever hated someone so much that you wish they would drop dead? Okay, so we're guilty and in need of a savior. But how do we manage our guilt? Maybe the first time you stole it was a really big deal, but after the 5th time, you didn't feel guilty like you used to. How did you manage your guilt? Did you suppress it? Shut it down? Did it sharpen your behavior? I was known as the upbeat kid in college, but there was one particular day where I had just watched porn before class, and I felt emasculated. One of my classmates, a girl from Germany I barely knew that day, asked me, "Hey, what's wrong? You're not yourself today." My guilt had turned me into a shell of the person I once was. So how does your cleric manage their guilt when they step out of line with their god? In this moment, your cleric has 2 options. They can run to their god, or they can run away. It really comes down to how they think their god will react to their sin. Perhaps if your cleric runs to your deity, there might be a confrontation. But sadly, the more common option that I'm sure we've all tried before is to run away. I have a challenge for you the next time you roleplay your cleric that will be hard to pull off, but the payoff will be well worth it. But first, let's take a look at this ancient Hebrew story in the Garden of Literal Eden. The main characters, Adam and Eve, did the one thing God told them not to do. They ate a bad fruit. Before this, they only knew good. But after eating this fig that a lot of people call an apple, they now knew evil too. They had done wrong, so they were ashamed. But instead of running to the God that they were supposed to represent on the earth, they ran away from him and hid themselves. Because they broke the rules, they could no longer be trusted to rule over the heart of the earth, so they lost their jobs and got kicked out of Eden. Just like Adam and Eve, running usually is our default when we feel guilty or ashamed. So what if your cleric starts losing their powers when they run from their deity the next time they feel guilty or shame over their disobedience? We so often as players cling to our power, forgetting that sometimes letting go of our power for the sake of roleplay raises the stakes for your story in a way that even the cult of Matthew never could. That's right, I said it. It's not blasphemy if it's the truth. I've yet to see it done, but to the player who has the courage to do this, props to you. But listen carefully, because the way you roleplay this will determine whether your players are staring at their cell phones or leaning forward on the edge of their seats, hungry for more. But it all hinges on this tiny nuance I'm about to share with you that can be seen through the lens of this other story. Now, this next story is a tale as old as time, so you've probably heard it before. But while I was doing research on how to make a better cleric for D&D, I came across something in it I had never seen before. An old man who lived on a farm had 2 sons. One day, his younger son said, "Screw this! I'm sick of cow poop, and you, old man, you're living way longer than I had hoped, so just give me your inheritance now." What the boy had said was unacceptable, but his father, being the kind old man that he was, overlooked his son's attitude, something I wouldn't have had the patience to do, and gave his son his share of the inheritance early. This bratty son, we'll call him Charles, left the country to travel across Europe, where he threw the wildest parties and hooked up with the hottest hookers, until many months later he was fully spent without a euro to his name. To pay his debts, the son tried begging, but no one gave him jack all. But he hadn't yet hit rock bottom because things were about to get much worse. You see, no one wanted to offer him a job because he was a foreigner. But he finally found work on a giant pig farm where it was his duty to carry enormous buckets of rotting compost to feed the pigs. But there was one hollow problem rumbling from deep within. You see, Charles' wages at the pig farm were so ridiculously abysmal that he was slowly starving to death. It was then that Charles caught himself craving the rotten compost the pigs were eating. That was the moment it finally hit Charles. He messed up. He'd been a little punk. He figured his dad was probably furious at him for what he did, but he also knew that even his dad's farm hands ate all the real food they wanted, because in his father's house there was always enough. It was at this moment, staring into the rotten compost, that Charles came to his senses and decided, "Oh boy, it's better to be a servant in my father's house than to starve to death before getting eaten by these pigs." So the next morning, Charles called in sick before setting out to make the long, arduous trip back home. But the whole way there, he was trying to think of what he was going to say to his dad. What words could possibly cool down his father's fury after he had expressed that he wanted his dad to die? But nothing could have prepared Charles for his return home, because what he didn't know was that his father had been watching patiently, waiting for him to come home every single day. While Charles was still a long ways away, his father saw a spindly figure hobbling far off in the distance. And the life returned to his father's eyes. The father ran towards Charles as fast as the old man's legs could carry him, and he grabbed his son with both arms, giving Charles a hug so strong it would have put an owl-bear mother to shame. He then gave his son the best drip from his very own wardrobe and threw a welcome home party for Charles with all the family members and farmhands because the father loved the son. But how does this story help you roleplay a better cleric? I'm glad you asked. But first, what if I told you that I want you to look good? So I'm writing a book that saves you time by giving you D&D markets for your fantasy world, so you never have to worry about giving your players a well-thought-out shopping experience ever again. I call it the Game Master's Market Maker, with over 1,000 markets waiting to be made. You won't want to miss out. You can join the waitlist now to be notified when I release it. It's the link down below. Now, predictable is boring, but the characters in this story were, if you ask me, anything but. While there's many things we can learn from this tale, I want to focus on one small principle that is often missed, and that is, what was Charles thinking when he walked into Mordor? Were Charles' actions towards his father wrong and hurtful? Was the father really angry at Charles? And did Charles really know his father? What most people don't see is how this applies to themselves. Let's pretend for a moment your cleric is Charles, and the father is your god. Sinning happens, we've all sinned, and if you roleplay a cleric that never struggles with sin, then stop. You're hurting your roleplay. Because perfection is not authentic. But let's observe a scenario where your cleric slips up, just like all humans do, and disobeys the god they've sworn to represent. Charles perceived that his father would be pissed off, but in reality, his father missed him and was overjoyed when he came home. When it comes to your roleplay, your cleric's perception is everything. And no, I'm not talking about that little number on your character sheet that lets you know if you're in danger. If you tie your cleric's insecurity to their obedience, you'll have your players scrolling through Pinterest over your predictable antics. But if you tie your cleric's insecurity to their perception of what they think their god is thinking, or how well your cleric thinks they're obeying God, you'll be brewing matcha lattes so strong it will make your cleric's IBS feel like a gentle kiss on a wet April morning, because a false belief is tea worth spilling. Oh, but Assassin, I'm falling asleep during all your stories. Okay, but when I feel close to God, I'm always asking people how they're doing and making sure they're okay. But when I feel like I've hurt God by doing what isn't right, it's as though I fall off the face of the map. I've begun to recognize that all my power comes from God, and that apart from Him, I am nothing special. Maybe your cleric is super social and emotionally present whenever they're obeying their god, just like that basic cleric we all know and love. But imagine if your emotionally supportive cleric suddenly becomes a pessimist during the next session, but no one in your party knows that the real, much deeper reason your cleric is being a Debbie Downer is because your cleric feels like they've let their god down. Now, when I mess up, I run to my god because I know he loves me and wants to help me get back on track. Wow, real life character development. And if you're a GM, consider in advance how a player's god will react to their cleric's disobedience. Are they a harsh, selfish deity with a penchant for punishment? Or are they a forgiving deity who loves spending time with their patrons?